We tend to take Arthur Conan Doyle pretty much as he comes. Big, blustery, good-humored, a bit of a cross between Holmes and Challenger with a twinkle in his eye. And at the core of his character is his unwavering sense of right and wrong. Throughout his life, he always let it be known when he thought an injustice was being committed. And in his personal life, he followed a strict code of moral conduct. So it comes as a great shock to learn that Conan Doyle has been accused of perpetrating a dastardly crime, an offense with dozens of victims and historic consequences. Oh, I'm not talking about stealing the plot of The Hound or murdering Fletcher Robinson. No, I'm talking about a real crime.
On December 18, 1912, two prominent British archaeologists announced the discovery of the remains of a new form of primitive human. It was more ancient by far than any other human fossil found in Britain, maybe as much as 500,000 years old. It was a monumental find, a first known Englishman, a serious coup for British science. The first of the fossil fragments had been unearthed by Charles Dawson in 1908, near his home in Sussex. Dawson was a solicitor and an amateur geologist, and he'd previously written a number of archaeological papers that had earned him something of a reputation in the scientific community. Lending professional credibility to the discovery was Dawson's mentor, Arthur Smith Woodward, in charge of the Department of Geology at the British Museum of Natural History. Woodward had worked for the museum for more than half of his 48 years, gradually working his way up the management ladder. Fellow of the Royal Society, president of the Geological Society, he was an influential figure in the archaeology world. The location of the discovery was a roadside gravel pit on a farm called Barkham Manor, near Piltdown in Sussex. Dawson wrote to Woodward about his initial discoveries early in 1912, and the two men began digging together on weekends during the summer, looking for more fragments. They unearthed pieces of a skull, part of the jaw, a number of primitive flint implements, and assorted fossil animal remains.
This is Woodward's reconstruction of the human skull. The dark color represents the original fossil pieces, and the white bits are the reconstructed part. They only found the right side of the jaw, with two molar teeth still in place. The jaw fragment itself was ape-like in structure, but the areas that would have displayed distinctly human or ape characteristics, the hinge region and the chin, had been broken off. The two molars showed distinct flat wear patterns, which is only ever seen in a human jaw, never in apes. The canine tooth, which was found separately by Dawson and Woodward the following summer in 1913, was clearly human in size and wear, so it put a stop to any objections that the jaw might actually be from an ape and not the same human as the skull pieces.
In the end, this combination of human-like skull and ape-like jaw was unique, a complete new human species. Dawson on his own dug up skull fragments from two more similar individuals at other locations nearby in 1913 and 1915. No more pieces of Piltdown Man were ever discovered. For the next 30 years, through two world wars, there was some debate as to whether the skull and jaw belonged to the same individual, and as more fossil humans were unearthed around the world, the Piltdown collection became more and more of an anomaly, never really fitting into the emerging picture of the human family tree. Finally, in 1953, three British scientists began to ask new questions about Britain's most famous ancestor. They performed newly developed chemical dating tests, and their conclusions were stunning. The jaw, it turned out, had come from an orangutan. The skull was indeed human, but was not 500,000 years old, only 500 years old. All of the pieces had been artificially stained to make them look ancient. The ape teeth had also been filed down to simulate human wear patterns. The exposure of the forgery touched off the hunt for the forger. Charles Dawson was a prime suspect, but he had died back in 1915, and in the end, there was no smoking gun, no confession. The next 50 years saw a steady flow of new suspects, including prominent scientists, amateur anthropologists, and members of the British Museum staff. But in 1983, an article in an American popular science magazine accused a new perpetrator, an outsider to the scientific community. John Hathaway Winslow and Alfred Meyer, in the September issue of Science 83 magazine, proposed that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle committed the forgery at Piltdown. Winslow seems to have been the primary author of this novel theory. Meyer was his editorial partner. Winslow claimed that he had evidence of motive, means, and opportunity. He said that perpetrating the hoax was entirely in character for Conan Doyle, and he claimed that Conan Doyle had left clues in his 1912 novel The Lost World, coded messages that pointed to his guilt. But there was more to come. In 1996, magazine editor Robert Anderson added more fuel to Winslow's theory in an article in Pacific Discovery magazine. Anderson's name may have been under the title, but the man behind the curtain, the guy who actually developed the theory, was a historian of science named Richard Milner. His new evidence was based on an even closer reading of The Lost World.
That was 15 years ago. Why are we even discussing this question today? Well, whether or not the case had any merit, it certainly had legs. A new scandal was born and continues to flourish today. Now, anyone who writes or talks about Piltdown Man has to deal with the question of Conan Doyle done it.
So let's lay out the case in a systematic way and see whether it stands up. According to Winslow, Conan Doyle's strong belief in spiritualism placed him in frequent conflict with scientific skeptics, including one prominent biologist, Edwin Ray Lankester. Back in 1876, Lankester had publicly declared war on mediums. He'd caught the celebrated American medium Henry Slade red-handed creating fake spiritualist phenomena. Lankester argued that if you catch one spiritualist cheat, they're probably all cheats. Winslow quotes from a Conan Doyle story to prove that he took strong issue with Lankester's logic. In the 1883 story, The Captain of the Pole Star, a leading sympathetic character, referring specifically to the Slade affair, insists that single cases of fraud are no reason to deny the truth of spiritualism. Winslow argues that Conan Doyle engineered Piltdown years later in 1908 to get back at Lankester and skeptics like him. Piltdown was a headline-grabbing case that would fool some scientists and therefore, using Lankester's own logic, condemn them all.
This motive only works if Conan Doyle was a committed spiritualist in 1908. But The Captain of the Pole Star shows an openness about the spirit world, not a fiery passion. And the weight of opinion among Conan Doyle biographers is that, though he'd studied paranormal phenomena and spiritualism since 1881, he was actually a somewhat detached investigator. He believed that spiritualist phenomena were real, and he engaged in some enthusiastic debates. But the fire, the passion, did not arrive until 1916, when he fully adopted spiritualism as his personal religion. 8 years later, in 1908, as the Piltdown pieces were being planted in Sussex, Conan Doyle was not yet converted. At that crucial date, his motive simply wasn't there.
And Conan Doyle was not then, or ever for that matter, an opponent of science or an enemy of scientists. Conan Doyle and Ray Lankester were in fact friends. Lankester's name appears in a complementary context in The Lost World, and its early editions included illustrations based on one of Lankester's books. Lankester later wrote to compliment him on the novel. There's just no evidence in this relationship of any motive for revenge.
And there's one more glaring gotcha in this House of Cards theory. If Conan Doyle's intent was to expose science as gullible, why did he never spring his trap? Why didn't he let it be known that the whole thing was a fake and watch scientific faces turn red? But by 1953, when the truth finally came out, Lankester and his fellow skeptics were all dead. So, for that matter, was Arthur Conan Doyle. So his supposed plan failed.
So much for motive. Would faking fossils have been in character for him? I'm not going to argue that Conan Doyle was a man of sterling character and so above suspicion, but we can look at how he responded to similar situations in his life, and we can decide on balance of probability whether faking the Piltdown fossils would have been consistent with the Conan Doyle we know. The supposed motto was to teach the materialist scientists a lesson, basically to right a wrong, to address an injustice. And there are many examples in Conan Doyle's life of his reactions to perceived injustices. In each case, he responded swiftly and characteristically. He wrote, he went public, rapidly, persistently, and loudly public. His pamphlets were printed at his own expense, by the thousands, and he refused a penny of profit from their sale. He wrote letters to the press, he lectured, lobbied, organized. What better example than his last and most ambitious campaign, his crusade for spiritualism? His battles were always fought very much in public view because he had an unshakable conviction that the great British public would in the end support him. He had no interest in backroom squabbling. Skulking around planting fake fossils in secret would have been highly uncharacteristic of him. Winslow refers to Conan Doyle as a jokester, a man who loved hoaxes. Well, he certainly loved a good practical joke, like dressing up as Challenger and engineering fake photos in the first editions of The Lost World, but these were intended to poke gentle fun and to raise a laugh, not to humiliate or ridicule. Piltdown, on the other hand, was not a joke. It was a nasty bit of fraud. It had real victims, scientific reputations in particular, and scientific progress in general. In 1953, when the truth was revealed, nobody was laughing. Winslow claims that Arthur Conan Doyle was singularly fascinated by both jaws and skulls. As proof, he cites exactly 2 examples from Conan Doyle's vast literary output. But if we examine his entire body of work, we find no such emphasis on skulls or jaws. Now let's look at opportunity. Well, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's home at Crowborough was just 8 miles from Piltdown, and he was known to take long walks in the area, so Winslow says he could have visited the site whenever he wanted to. Since most of the remains were found on or near the surface of the soil, all he needed to do, claims Winslow, was drop them as he sauntered by. Conan Doyle actually knew Charles Dawson, the discoverer of Piltdown Man. They met in 1909, so he was in a perfect position to know when Dawson's team would be digging through the summer of 1912. And according to a 1912 letter from Dawson to Woodward, by the end of that year, Conan Doyle knew about the Piltdown finds. But let's take a look at the timeline. How did Conan Doyle get those first fake pieces to Dawson in 1908 before they met? Well, maybe somebody else spilled the beans about Dawson's gullibility to Sir Arthur back in 1908, but there's no evidence that Conan Doyle knew any of the handful of people who Dawson told about the Piltdown site before 1912. Here's the list of when and where the various pieces were uncovered at Piltdown and 2 other locations. Obviously, each piece needed to be placed precisely in the right spot in order for Dawson and his team to find it. But they'd also have to be planted at the right time, immediately before Dawson began to dig in that spot. After carefully crafting each fake, the perpetrator couldn't have all his effort wasted if the diggers happened to be working in a different place that day and missed the piece completely, or if the piece was washed away by a passing shower, or if it was picked up by someone else who didn't know what it was. The perpetrator would need to know Dawson's precise digging schedule, which was highly weather dependent and prone to last-minute changes, and of course, we have no evidence that Conan Doyle had any of this vital information.